The winter came early to the steppe that year. By the middle of November 1942, the temperature outside Stalingrad had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. The soldiers of the German Sixth Army had been issued summer uniforms, not because the Wehrmacht quartermaster had failed to plan for winter. The official explanation, repeated through the chain of command like a prayer, was that the war in the East would be finished before the cold arrived. The city on the Volga would fall. The Soviet Union would collapse. The boys would be home by Christmas. The summer uniforms were not an oversight. They were an expression of institutional certainty, a belief so deeply held that contradicting it with warm coats and insulated boots would have been a form of defeatism. That certainty was about to be tested in the most savage urban battle in the history of human warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His name was Wilhelm Hoffmann. He was a 23-year-old infantryman from Dortmund, assigned to the 267th Infantry Regiment of the German 94th Infantry Division. He had volunteered in the summer of 1941, caught up in the wave of national confidence that followed the stunning early victories of Operation Barbarossa. By the autumn of that year, German armored columns had advanced deeper into Soviet territory than any army in history. Entire Soviet army groups had been encircled and destroyed. The prisoner counts were in the hundreds of thousands. The newspapers back home called it the greatest military campaign ever conducted. Hoffmann kept a diary. It survived the war. It is one of the most extraordinary documents to emerge from the Eastern Front, not because it describes the thoughts of a general or a politician or a strategist, but because it records, in the unguarded language of a young man writing for himself alone, the complete arc of psychological destruction that Stalingrad inflicted on the soldiers sent to capture it. His early entries, written during the summer advance toward the Volga, read like the letters of a tourist. He writes about the immense flatness of the Russian landscape, the strange beauty of the sunflower fields stretching to the horizon, the curious behavior of the local population. He writes about the heat and the dust. He writes about his confidence. In one entry from July 1942, he describes watching a column of Soviet prisoners marching west under German guard, thousands of them, heads down, shuffling through the dust. He writes that the war in the East is essentially over, that these broken men represent what remains of Soviet military power, that the Volga cannot be far. He was not unusual in this belief. The soldiers of the Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had been advancing since the summer with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. They had crossed the Don River. They had swept across the open steppe where German armor performed exactly as the tactical manual said it should. The terrain was ideal for the kind of warfare the Wehrmacht had perfected in France and in the early campaigns of Barbarossa. Open ground, visible enemies, the clean, geometrically satisfying victories of encirclement and annihilation. Then, they reached Stalingrad. The city stretched for roughly 60 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River. It was not a beautiful city. It was an industrial city, built rapidly during the Soviet industrialization drives of the 1930s, full of enormous factories producing tractors, steel, and chemicals. The largest of these was the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, which had been converted to produce tanks. The Red October steel works covered a vast area of the northern city. The Barricady gun factory supplied artillery to the Soviet fronts. These were not elegant structures. They were massive, brutal, utilitarian complexes of brick and reinforced concrete, built to produce things rather than to be admired. The German High Command understood that capturing Stalingrad would sever the Volga transport artery, through which Soviet oil from the Caspian region flowed northward to fuel the Red Army. The city also bore the name of the Soviet leader, which gave its capture a symbolic significance that both sides understood. Hitler had stated publicly that Stalingrad would fall. Stalin had ordered that it would not. Two ideological systems had made the city the hinge point of the entire war. For the soldiers of the Sixth Army, however, none of this strategic architecture was visible. What was visible, as they approached across the steppe in August 1942, was the city burning on the horizon. The Luftwaffe had preceded the ground assault with one of the heaviest bombing campaigns of the war. On August 23, 1942, over 600 German aircraft flew sorties against Stalingrad, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs across the civilian districts of the city. The fires burned for days. The smoke column was visible for over 100 kilometers. Hoffmann wrote in his diary that the burning city looked like the end of the world. He did not mean it as a warning. He meant it as a spectacle. The 6th Army entered the western outskirts of Stalingrad in early September. With the confidence of an army that had been winning for 16 months, the commanders expected urban combat to last perhaps 2 weeks. Intelligence assessments suggested Soviet resistance was near its breaking point. Aerial reconnaissance showed defenders retreating toward the river. The logic of the campaign said that cornered men with their backs to a river and a victorious army pressing from 3 sides, would eventually surrender or die. 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Then the city would be German, the Volga would be cut, and the strategic objective that Hitler had proclaimed to the world would be achieved. General Paulus planned accordingly. He allocated supplies for a short, intense urban battle. His logistics chains, already stretched thin across the vast distances of the steppe, were calibrated for a campaign that would end before the deep cold came. His soldiers carried ammunition for a decisive engagement, not for a siege. They carried rations for a push to the river, not for months of grinding attrition and rubble. What none of them understood, what the intelligence reports had failed to convey, and what no amount of aerial reconnaissance could reveal, was that the Soviet defenders of Stalingrad were not planning to surrender. They were planning to use the city as a weapon. The man responsible for this decision was General Vasily Chuikov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, who had been assigned the defense of Stalingrad in September 1942. Chuikov was a rough, direct man from a peasant family who had risen through the ranks of the Red Army through a combination of physical courage and tactical intelligence. He had studied the nature of German military power carefully, and he had identified a specific vulnerability in the Wehrmacht's operational system. The Germans were brilliant in open terrain. Their combined arms doctrine, the integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a coordinated killing machine, was the most sophisticated military system in the world in 1942. It had conquered France in 6 weeks. It had driven deep into the Soviet Union in a matter of months. It worked by maintaining momentum, by keeping the enemy off balance, by striking before defenders could organize coherent resistance. Chuikov's insight was deceptively simple. Take away the space. In open terrain, German tanks could maneuver freely. Artillery could range over kilometers. The Luftwaffe could identify and attack concentrations of Soviet troops. The Wehrmacht's speed and coordination gave it a decisive advantage over a slower, less mobile opponent. But in the rubble of a destroyed city, none of that applied. Tanks could not maneuver in streets filled with collapsed buildings. Artillery could not be used effectively when German and Soviet positions were separated by a single floor of a ruined factory. The Luftwaffe could not bomb enemy positions when those positions were 50 meters from German lines. Chuikov called his tactical philosophy hugging the enemy. His soldiers were ordered to stay as close to the German front line as humanly possible, to live in the same rubble, to fight for individual rooms and floors and staircases, to make the battle so intimate and so savage and so granular that all of the technological advantages the Germans possessed became irrelevant. He reduced a modern industrial war to something that resembled medieval combat, fought with knives and entrenching tools and the butt ends of rifles in darkness and dust and the smell of burning dot, and then he ordered his men to hold. For the soldiers of the German 6th Army, the battle that followed was unlike anything their training had prepared them for. Hoffmann's diary changes in character as the weeks in Stalingrad accumulate. The early entries from the city are still confident, still describing forward progress in terms of streets taken and buildings cleared. He writes about specific engagements, about close quarters fighting that is brutal but manageable, about the expectation that the next day's advance will reach the river. Then the entries begin to shift. He writes about a building that his company has attacked for times and taken for times and lost for times. He writes about the sound of Soviet snipers, who seem to be everywhere and nowhere, who fire from positions that cannot be located and cannot be suppressed. He writes about a factory complex that has become a universe unto itself, a world of shattered machinery and collapsed ceilings and floors that give way without warning. Into darkness below. He writes about the cold, which has arrived despite the promises that it would not matter by now. By October, his entries have lost the quality of a man observing events from a position of confidence. They read instead like the notes of a man trying to hold onto his own identity in conditions designed to dissolve. The battle for the factory district in the northern part of the city was the most intensive industrial combat of the entire war. The Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, the Red October Steel Works, the Barricady Gun Factory. These enormous complexes became the centers of fighting that lasted for weeks inside individual buildings. The scale of the structures made conventional military thinking meaningless. A single workshop in the tractor factory was the size of a football field. The ceiling was supported by massive reinforced concrete pillars. The machinery, enormous lathes and presses and furnaces, had been partially destroyed by the bombing and the fighting, creating a landscape of metal debris and shadows that neither side could fully control. German engineers developed specialized tactics for fighting in such spaces. Sturmgruppen, storm groups, were small teams of specially trained soldiers equipped with submachine guns, grenades, flamethrowers, and explosive charges. They worked in coordinated teams, one group suppressing while another advanced, clearing rooms methodically, using explosives to blow holes through walls rather than exposing themselves in doorways and corridors. The tactics were effective. They were also extraordinarily costly in lives. Soviet defenders developed their own countermeasures. They created fortified positions inside the factory buildings using machinery as cover, running telephone wire between positions to maintain communications. When radio was useless in the steel and concrete maze, stockpiling ammunition and food to sustain isolated pockets of resistance for days or weeks. They trained sniper teams to operate in the rubble, identifying firing positions that offered clean lines of sight across contested ground, while remaining nearly impossible to locate from the German side. The most famous of these snipers was Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Ural Mountains who had grown up hunting in terrain that taught patience, concealment, and the discipline to wait for a single clean shot. Zaitsev arrived in Stalingrad in September 1942 and became, over the following months, a figure of such symbolic importance to the Soviet defense that the political officers of the 62nd Army organized a sniper school around him, training dozens of students in his methods. His confirmed kills during the Battle of Stalingrad numbered to 125. The actual figure, including unconfirmed engagements, was likely higher. For the German infantry moving through the rubble, the sniper threat was a constant psychological weight. Every movement across open ground carried the risk of a single shot from an invisible position. Soldiers learned to move in unpredictable patterns, to avoid silhouetting themselves against light, to cross exposed spaces in sudden sprints rather than deliberate advances. The discipline required to move through ground where death could arrive without warning. From any direction, at any moment, wore on men in ways that conventional combat, however intense, did not. Hoffman writes about this in terms that are remarkable for their honesty. He writes that in France, in the early days of Barbarossa, combat had felt like something with a shape, something with a beginning and an end. You attacked, you achieved an objective, you consolidated, you moved on. There was a logic to it, a structure that gave meaning to individual actions. In Stalingrad, he writes, there is no shape. There is only the building you are in, the building you are trying to reach, and the men in both who are trying to kill each other. He writes that he no longer thinks about the war. He thinks about the next hour. The supply situation for the 6th Army deteriorated steadily through October and November. The logistics chains that Paulus had calibrated for a short urban battle had not been rebuilt for a prolonged siege. Food, ammunition, and fuel were reaching the front line units in quantities that were sufficient for survival, but not for the kind of intensive combat the city demanded. Soldiers on the front lines were receiving reduced rations. Artillery ammunition was being rationed. The sense among the men that the campaign was not going according to plan could not be suppressed by the communiques from higher headquarters that continued to speak of imminent victory. Then, on November 19, 1942, the ground shook. Not from German guns, from Soviet ones. Operation Uranus, the Soviet strategic counteroffensive that had been planned in secret for months, opened with artillery barrage of extraordinary scale. Over 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously against the Romanian forces, holding the flanks of the German position around Stalingrad. The Romanians, poorly equipped and not deeply invested in a German strategic objective, broke under the weight of the assault. Soviet armored columns poured through the gaps in the line and drove deep into the steppe. On both sides of the city, within 4 days, the two Soviet pincer movements had met at Kalach, on the Don River, approximately 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army, 330,000 men, was surrounded. The encirclement, what the Germans called the Kessel, the cauldron, was complete. Hoffman's diary entry from the day the encirclement was confirmed is one of the most devastating passages in the document. He had been aware that something was happening on the flanks. There had been rumors for days, the kind of rumors that spread through armies when the official communications stopped making sense. He writes that when the news came down through the chain of command that the army was surrounded, he did not feel fear. He felt something stranger than fear. He felt a kind of terrible clarity, as if something he had known without allowing himself to know it had finally been confirmed. He writes that the certainty he had carried since the summer, the certainty that Stalingrad would fall and the war would end, and he would go home, was gone. In its place was a question he could not answer. How do you fight your way out of something that has no outside? General Paulus requested permission from Hitler to attempt a breakout. He calculated that the Sixth Army, if it moved immediately while it still had fuel and ammunition and the physical strength to march, could fight its way through the Soviet encirclement and reach German lines to the west. The operation would be costly. Some units would not survive, but the army could be saved. Hitler refused. The reason given was strategic. Stalingrad must be held. The city bearing the Soviet leader's name could not be surrendered. Paulus was told that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, that a relief force under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was being assembled to break through to the Kessel from the south. The Sixth Army should hold its positions, maintain the siege of Stalingrad, and wait for relief. This was not presented as a desperate gamble. It was presented as a plan, as a certainty. Hermann Goering, the commander of the Luftwaffe, had told Hitler that his aircraft could deliver the 500 tons of supplies per day that the Sixth Army needed to sustain itself. This was a number Goering had provided without consulting his logistics officers or his transport commanders. The actual capacity of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet, even under ideal conditions, was roughly 300 tons per day. The conditions over Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 were not ideal. They were among the worst flying conditions in the world. The airlift that was supposed to sustain 330,000 men through a Russian winter never delivered more than a fraction of what was needed. On most days, the aircraft bringing supplies into the Kessel delivered between 70 and 100 tons, roughly 15 to 20% of the minimum required. On many days, bad weather grounded the transports entirely. The soldiers inside the Kessel began to starve. The relief force that Manstein assembled did reach to within approximately 48 kilometers of the Kessel's southern edge before Soviet pressure halted its advance. Whether a breakout attempt by the Sixth Army could have linked up with the relief column at that point remains one of the most debated counterfactual questions of the war. What is certain is that Hitler refused to authorize the breakout, and the relief force was ultimately withdrawn to prevent it from being encircled in turn. The Sixth Army was alone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Inside the Kessel, the reality of the Army's situation became impossible to disguise. The rations issued to soldiers were reduced first to combat rations, then to survival rations, then to quantities that medical officers recognized as starvation level. the daily caloric allocation for soldiers on the front line dropped to below 1,000 calories in December, a level insufficient to maintain body weight even at rest, catastrophically insufficient for men fighting in temperatures that had dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. The soldiers began to eat their horses, the cavalry and artillery horses that had pulled guns, and supply wagons across the steppe were slaughtered and consumed until none remained. Then the soldiers ate whatever could be found in the rubble of the city. They scraped frozen earth looking for anything organic. They boiled leather to make broth. They ate cats and dogs and birds. The medical situation deteriorated in parallel with the food supply. Wounds that would have been manageable with proper treatment became life-threatening. As medical supplies ran out, frostbite amputated fingers and toes and feet from men who had no winter clothing. Dysentery spread through the crowded basements and bunkers where soldiers sheltered from the cold. Typhus appeared in December. The field hospitals, originally established to treat combat wounds, became overwhelmed with men dying of starvation and cold and disease. Hoffman's diary entries from December and January become shorter. The handwriting, which had been neat and regular in the summer, grows erratic. The observations that had characterized his earlier writing, the notes about landscape and people and the texture of events, fall away. What remains are fragments. A description of finding a dead comrade frozen solid in a doorway. A note about the sound that artillery makes when you are so hungry that the concussion seems to affect your vision. A single sentence, written on a day when he apparently could manage nothing more. I do not understand how this happened. He was not alone in this confusion. The soldiers of the 6th Army had been among the most effective fighting men in the world. They had been trained in a military system that had produced the most consistently successful operational results of any army in modern history. They had marched into the Soviet Union believing in the superiority of their equipment, their doctrine, their leadership, and ultimately themselves. The summer of 1942 had seemed to confirm everything they had been taught. The advance to Stalingrad had been rapid. The Soviet defenders had broken before them. The city had seemed within reach, and yet here they were, surrounded, starving, dying in a city that had consumed them. The psychological dimension of this collapse deserves careful attention, because it is what makes the Battle of Stalingrad more than a military catastrophe. It is what makes it a story about the limits of belief. The German soldier of 1942 had been formed by years of National Socialist propaganda that told a coherent and intoxicating story. Germany was a nation of superior capacity, burdened by the injustices of Versailles, prevented by Jewish financial manipulation and Bolshevik aggression from achieving its rightful place in the world. The Wehrmacht was the expression of this national capacity in military form. It had demonstrated its superiority on every battlefield. The Soviet Union was a racially inferior state, governed by Jewish Bolshevik ideology, sustained only by the terror its leaders imposed on its people. When the Wehrmacht struck, the Soviet system would collapse, because inferior systems always collapsed before superior ones. This was not simply government propaganda. For many German soldiers, it was a lived reality confirmed by their own experience. They had watched Poland fall in for weeks. They had watched France fall in 6 weeks. They had watched Soviet armies collapse and surrender by the hundreds of thousands in the summer and autumn of 1941. The story the propaganda told matched the evidence their own eyes provided. Stalingrad provided different evidence. The Soviet soldiers defending the city were not collapsing. They were fighting in a manner that the German narrative about Soviet military inferiority could not explain. They were fighting with skill, with tenacity, with tactical ingenuity, and with a ferocity that matched or exceeded anything the German troops could sustain. The snipers in the rubble, the storm groups defending factory buildings floor by floor, the political officers who shot men who retreated without orders and inspired men who remained, none of this matched the image of a racially and ideologically inferior enemy that German soldiers had been taught to expect. More disorienting still was the evidence of Soviet industrial and logistical capacity that accumulated as the weeks passed. Every night, across the Volga River, Soviet ferries brought supplies into the city. ammunition, food, replacement soldiers, medical equipment. The German artillery and air attacks that targeted these crossing points destroyed some of the ferries and killed some of the men waiting to board them. But the crossings never stopped. The river that was supposed to be the final boundary, the last obstacle, was instead a highway. And on the other side of it, Soviet production was generating the men and material to sustain the defense indefinitely. The numbers tell a story that the German soldiers inside the Kessel were only beginning to comprehend. During the entire Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet factories produced over 13,000 tanks. German factories produced approximately 6,000 for the entire Eastern Front. During the same period, the Soviet artillery that had executed Operation Uranus represented a concentration of firepower that no German operational plan had accounted for, because German intelligence had consistently underestimated Soviet production capacity. They had been told the Soviet industrial base was shattered. It was not shattered. It had been relocated east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of the Luftwaffe, and it was producing war material at a rate that the German economic planners had declared impossible. The men who had marched into the Soviet Union, believing in the story of German superiority, were discovering that the story had been wrong in its most fundamental assumption. Their enemy was not inferior. Their enemy was in certain respects stronger. And the army that had seemed to confirm the story of German invincibility had advanced so far, on supply lines so thin, into terrain so vast, that it had outrun any possibility of saving itself when the strategic calculation turned against it. Hoffmann understood this, in the fragmented way that a starving man in a frozen cellar can understand anything. His diary does not articulate a systematic critique of National Socialist ideology. He was not a political philosopher. He was a young man from Dortmund who had believed what he had been taught, and found himself in a place where what he had been taught was demonstrably, catastrophically, unfixable wrong. He writes, in one of his final coherent entries, about a conversation he had with a fellow soldier, a man named Kurt from Munich who had been a school teacher before the war. Kurt, Hoffmann writes, told him that the worst thing was not the cold or the hunger or the fear. The worst thing was having to think about what the summer had been, when they had been certain, when they had been winning, when the story had made sense, because now the story did not make sense, and there was no other story to replace it. There was only the Kessel. The German attempt to maintain any pretense of offensive capacity inside the Kessel ended in January 1943. The Western Pocket, the area around the town of Potomnik where the main airfield was located, was overrun by Soviet forces on the 22nd of January. The last functioning airstrip, at Gumruk, fell shortly after. The airlift, inadequate as it had been, ended. Whatever supplies remained inside the Kessel were what the army had. Nothing more was coming. Paulus sent a final signal to Hitler requesting permission to surrender. He described the condition of his army in terms that left no ambiguity. Men dying of starvation, and cold in their positions, ammunition nearly exhausted, no medical supplies, no prospect of relief. He requested that he be allowed to end the suffering. Hitler's response was to promote Paulus to field marshal. In the entire history of the Prussian and German military tradition, no German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. Hitler was communicating, in the language his commanders understood, that Paulus was expected to die rather than capitulate. The promotion was an instruction to commit suicide. Paulus did not comply. On the 31st of January, 1943, he surrendered himself and the remnants of the southern pocket of the Kessel to Soviet forces. The northern pocket, commanded by General Karl Strecker, held until February 2nd. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 330,000 German and Axis soldiers encircled in November 1942, approximately 91,000 survived to surrender. The rest had died in the fighting, or of wounds, or of starvation, or of cold, or of disease in the final weeks of the encirclement. It was the largest single destruction of a German military force in the history of warfare. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, approximately 6,000 survived Soviet captivity to return to Germany. Most died in the camps at Beketovka and Krasnoarmysk in the months following their capture. their bodies too depleted by the months inside the Kessel to survive even the minimal conditions Soviet prisoner facilities provided. The men who walked into captivity at Stalingrad were not, in most cases, soldiers. They were skeletons. Wilhelm Hoffmann was among the survivors of the Kessel. His diary ends in January 1943 in an entry that is barely legible. The handwriting of a man whose hands could no longer reliably hold a pen. He records that he is alive. He records that it is very cold. He records that he does not know what will happen next. He survived Soviet captivity. He was one of the 6,000. He returned to Germany in the early 1950s, a decade after his capture, carrying the diary that documented his transformation from a confident young volunteer to a man who had watched his entire understanding of the world dissolve in the rubble and cold of a city on the Volga. The diary was published in the Soviet Union as a propaganda document during the war, excerpted to demonstrate the psychological collapse of the German army at Stalingrad. It was republished after the war as a historical document. It is now understood as something more than either. It is a record of what happens to human beings when the story they have been told about the world collides with the world as it actually is. The Battle of Stalingrad killed approximately 2 million people in total, accounting for Soviet military dead, German and Axis military dead, and the civilian population of the city caught between the two armies. The Soviet military suffered approximately 1,100,000 killed and wounded during the campaign. The German and Axis forces suffered approximately 800,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The civilian population of Stalingrad, which had numbered over 400,000 before the battle, was reduced to a few tens of thousands of survivors living in basements and sewers. By the time the fighting ended, these numbers are so large as to be nearly meaningless without context. Consider instead a single fact: the German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful military formations in the world in the summer of 1942. The army that had driven across the steppe in the heat and confidence of that July ceased to exist as a military organization by the 2nd of February, 1943. It did not retreat. It did not regroup. It was annihilated. The strategic consequences were immediate and permanent. For the first time in the war, Germany had suffered a defeat so large that it could not be disguised, denied, or minimized. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, declared for days of national mourning. German radio played solemn music. The image of German military invincibility, carefully constructed through for years of unbroken victories, was shattered. In the occupied countries of Europe, in the neutral nations watching from the sidelines, in the Allied capitals where the news was received with cautious hope, Stalingrad was understood as a turning point, not because the war was over. The war would continue for more than 2 years, but because the story of German inevitability was over. The Wehrmacht could be defeated. The Sixth Army had been destroyed. The question was no longer whether Germany would win the war. The question was how much longer it would take to lose it. For the survivors, those 6,000 men who eventually made it back to Germany, the experience of Stalingrad was not something that resolved into a coherent lesson or a manageable memory. The men who returned from the Kessel were, by most accounts, profoundly changed, in ways that they themselves often could not articulate. They had entered the Soviet Union as soldiers in a victorious army, sustained by a story that gave their service meaning and dignity. They had survived the destruction of that army in circumstances of almost unimaginable suffering. The story was gone. The certainty was gone. What remained was the memory of the Kessel, which most of them carried without speaking of it for the rest of their lives. Hoffmann is reported to have said, in an interview conducted years after his return, that what Stalingrad had taught him was not the lesson that wars are terrible, which he said he had known before. What it had taught him was something more specific and more difficult. That certainty is dangerous, that the most dangerous thing a soldier can carry into battle is not a weapon, but a belief that he already knows how the battle will end. The soldiers of the Sixth Army had marched into Stalingrad knowing how it would end. They were the Wehrmacht. They had never lost. The city would fall, the river would be cut, the enemy would collapse. They had been certain. The city did not fall. The river was not cut. The enemy did not collapse. And 330,000 men paid for that certainty with everything they had. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.